Hey everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus coming at you with a deck overview for Hardened Scales in the modern format. As a friendly reminder, if you do like these kind of deck overviews, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, leaving a constructive comment down below, and maybe letting us know what deck you'd like to see us cover next. So to start with Hardened Scales, we kind of have to start with its spiritual successor, and that is the Affinity deck. Now the Affinity deck you're seeing on the screen is the newer versions of Affinity, the one that's using things like Thoughtcast and Thought Monitor, along with things like Sojourner's Companion and Frogmite to get a head-on advantage in just in terms of raw resources. The old Affinity deck was obviously based around the card Mox Opal, using things like Cranial Plating, a bunch of cheap artifacts, obviously getting them into play, but it was a lot more explosive based in terms of what it was trying to do. It was more of a fast, aggressive deck that tried to overwhelm the opponent before they could get set up, and its really only true weakness was a ton of spot removal or a ton of artifact hate, things like Stony Silence. Obviously with the banning of Mox Opal, the deck lost a good bit of its explosiveness, and also with all of the printing of the various removal spells, a lot of other creature decks in the format, Affinity has kind of either had to evolve or die. You can name off a whole bunch of decks. In fact, Affinity, most of the creature tribal decks have had to adapt, whether it be humans, merfolk, the various Vizier combo decks, Heliod decks, etc. Basically, decks have had to become more resilient or they just die off. Affinity evolved into this kind of pseudo-grindy mid-range artifact deck that also happened to play out a bunch of cheap creatures, a bunch of cheap artifacts, and try to overwhelm the opponent with things like Nettlecyst, Cranial Plating, making everything on their deck a must-kill threat, along with things like Urza's Saga. Now, the deck we are covering today is kind of the other spiritual successor to Affinity, in that this takes over kind of the combo out of nowhere version of the deck. It uses the card Hardened Scales effectively to, if not double the amount of +1/+1 counters. For each occurrence, you get an additional +1/+1 counter. So if something would come in with 1, comes in with 2. If it would get 2, comes in with 3, etc. Zabaz does something very similar. It kind of serves as both a poor man's Arcbound Ravager and a poor Hardened Scales. It only affects the modular triggers, but it is another thing that does increase the amount of counters that get thrown around, especially with it, Arcbound Ravager, and Arcbound Worker being modular creatures. Another spell this deck utilizes is the Ozolith. Whenever a creature leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, put those counters on the Ozolith, and then during the beginning of your combat on your turn, the Ozolith can have those counters moved on to target creature. This allows you to throw around a bunch of counters and potentially kill your opponent out of nowhere with something like a Walking Ballista or Inkmoth Nexus. The card that most facilitates this is Arcbound Ravager, which is a modular creature, comes in with a 1/+1/+1 counter, then sacrifice an artifact, put a +1/+1 counter on Arcbound Ravager. While this doesn't seem particularly effective, if you use effects like Hardened Scales and Zabaz, you can be throwing around a lot of counters, especially if you have some artifacts to throw around, things like an extra Springleaf Drum, maybe a thing like an extra Ozolith laying around, and you can cast another one, etc. This is a very powerful effect that allows you to kind of blank some forms of removal, and this often becomes a magnet for your opponent's removal, and allows you to kind of kill your opponent out of nowhere. So you have 4 attacking creatures, your opponent has 3 blockers, you basically throw all the counters on the unblocked creature, suddenly your opponent's dead. Arcbound Ravager makes math very hard for both you and your opponent. Patchwork Automaton is a newer one to the thing. It's a 2/2 with Ward 2. Whenever you cast an artifact spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Patchwork Automaton. Obviously, this can grow very quickly and has the Ward 2, which makes it much more difficult to kill. It's a nice new addition to the deck. Throne of Gaft isn't in all these lists, but sacrifice an artifact to proliferate. Proliferate means you can put a counter on each thing that has a counter. Notably, this also includes players, so if a player has poison counters, this is also a way to proliferate poison counters, etc. And if you have something like Hardened Scales being thrown around, this can get out of hand quite quickly. Hairback Walker gives you a little bit of resilience against removal-based decks. Basically, it comes into play with X +1/+1 counters for an XX cost, and then you can play 1 and tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on Hairback Walker. And then whenever it dies, you get that many 1/1 colorless Thopter tokens for each +1/+1 counter on it. This can obviously create a variable army of Thopters if your opponent can't deal with it, or you can just crack it with Zabaz or Arcbound Ravager at your own leisure, often during your opponent's end step, to kill them with this overwhelming army of Thopters they can't deal with. Walking Ballista is a nice way both to deal with your opponent's early creatures, while also being a way to deal direct damage to your opponent if they happen to be able to clog up the board. And obviously this card has been proven to be very powerful out of both Karn sideboards and in other formats, including Pioneer, where it was banned for being part of the Heliod combo deck. But overall, this is kind of your way of closing the game if your opponent is able to kind of clog up the board. As far as the land base, there are some notable things. Obviously, you're an Urza Saga deck. This gives you some amount of resilience against opponents' spot removal, while also allowing you to create big beefy boys in the form of the constructs. Inkmoth Nexus, which is a 1/1 creature with flying that has Infect. This can be obviously very devastating with something like Arcbound Ravager, often leading to one-shot kills if your opponent is not able to deal with it, and adds to the complexity of playing against the deck for your opponent, as well as giving you additional lines to win the game. Beyond that, you are mostly a mono green deck in this version, with Grove of the Burn Willows being able to facilitate with Zabaz along with the copy of Springleaf Drone. Same thing with the Pathways, just enabling you to have that small bit of red mana you need. Power Depot is a modular land that whenever a creature comes into play, you can move the modular counter to it, which is obviously quite nice. Or is this the one? No, I don't know if you can actually move the modular counter off this one. There was a green land that allowed you to move the modular counter whenever it came into play. But this one obviously you can sacrifice for the modular counter if you need to, and then use 1 mana of any color to spend this to only cast artifacts or artifact abilities. Obviously, you're mostly an artifact deck, so this isn't really relevant. Gemstone Cavern to get a little bit ahead on the draw, allowing you to get a little bit ahead on mana. And then, obviously, Beseiju really needs no introduction to what it does. And then Blinkmoth is another creature-based land that can also pump your Inkmoth Nexi, while also being a way to kind of close out the game on its own, giving you a land that can be difficult for your opponent to interact with. Pendelhaven to pump up your 1/1s, although there aren't a ton of 1/1s in this deck, especially since you're throwing around counters, but it can be a way to keep your creatures alive if you're removing counters, or just pump them up in combat. So that is pretty much the main deck. Welding Jar to protect your things. Ancient Stirrings kind of ties it all together, allows you to find the various pieces that you're missing, as basically your entire deck is colorless if you include your lands, other than obviously your copies of Hardened Scales. Sideboard, this one's a little bit different. Dismember as a way of removal. One of the downsides of running effectively a mono green deck, you don't have access to a lot of removal, so Dismember it is. The Stone Brain is a new one from the Brothers' War. This is effectively a cranial extraction effect. Allows you to take out your opponent's key piece, whether it be a Tron land, whether it be the various cascade spells like Rhinos or Living End. So it can be quite important in some matchups, as there are some decks that do effectively rely on just one card. Relic of Progenitus, graveyard-based hate that you can get with Urza Saga, obviously. Pithing Needle to shut down activated abilities of problematic permanents. Haywire Might is an interesting one. It's both a way to gain a little bit of life and destroy or exile a non-creature artifact or enchantment. It can be important against some decks, whether it be something like Leyline Sanctity keeping you from Walking Ballisting them. Can obviously deal with something like a Roiling Vortex, the various different equipments out of decks, etc. Animation Module is an interesting one. It allows you to create an army of 1/1s every time something would have a +1/+1 counter on it. It used to be a much bigger part of this deck before some of the new additions. It used to be something that would allow the deck to go wide, and obviously saw play when the deck was something in the Pioneer format as well. Tamiyo Safekeeping, way to protect your permanents, gain a little bit of life. Very good against anything packing removal, allowing you to keep your key piece alive and potentially kill your opponent out of nowhere. Nature's Claim is a split card, allows you to deal with any of your opponent's problematic enchantments or artifacts, whether it be things like Blood Moon, although this deck doesn't really affect too much by Blood Moon, although losing to Inkmoth Nexus and Urza Saga can be kind of annoying, so you can kill Blood Moons and stuff. And also in matchups against Burn and such can also give you a little bit of cushion by potentially destroying one of your own things, and sometimes blowing up your own artifacts can allow you to move counters to move the Ozolith, kill your opponent out of nowhere, serving as a kind of a one-shot version of Arcbound Ravager and Zabaz. Now we're taking a look at a slightly different variant. This one is having a slight white splash. We've already covered a lot of the cards in it. The things you get access to, things like a Ganjo out of the sideboard in addition to a copy of Boseiju, so obviously can make combat a little bit more difficult for your opponent. Another key card is Esper Sentinel, which makes removal a little bit more costly for your opponent in the early turns, or you get to draw cards, both of which are nice. Blacksmith Skill is kind of a Tamiyo safekeeping that allows you to keep your permanents in safe, as well as pumping your creatures. And then another addition from Brothers War is Steel Seraph, which is a 6-mana, 5/4 artifact. At the beginning of combat on your turn, target creature you control gains your choice of Flying, Vigilance, or Lifelink till the end of turn. Obviously, this can be very important in a couple situations. If your opponent's got the ground kind of clogged up, you can kind of give the key creature Flying and dome them out of nowhere. Also, you can give the creature Lifelink, something like Shadow Spear would normally do, to allow you racing situations. And notably, this also comes with the prototype mechanic, which allows you to cast it alternatively for 1 white. Turns it into a 3/3 instead of a 5/4, but notably you still get its abilities. Blacksmith Skill, once again, instead of Tamiyo Safekeeping. Still running a copy of Grafdigger's Cage, which is quite nice against some graveyard-based decks, although it's not quite as good because things like Living End and I believe Indomitable Creativity also gets around this because of the way creativity is templated. So I don't know that Cage is really the graveyard hate piece I'd be running right now. But, it does keep things like Collected Company and stuff at bay as well. Court of Calling. Haywire we've already kind of talked about. Hallowed Moonlight, this is very notable in a couple of different matchups. Anything trying to come out of the graveyard this exile, so things like Dredge. I believe this also affects Living End because it enters the battlefield and it wasn't cast, and also helps to shut down Indomitable Creativity from getting its pieces into play. Final version we're going to look at is basically a mono green version. Not seeing anything too terribly exciting in the main deck that we haven't already seen. This deck is a lot of 4-ofs, except for the 1-ofs like Springleaf Drum, Arcbound Worker, etc. But the main thing this version is running is Voidmere, which obviously is a little bit awkward if you own 0-mana spells like Wielding Jar, but very good against the Cascade decks, etc. Chalice of the Void, once again, also very good against the Cascade decks. But the other piece of sideboard tech is Orvar, the All-Form, which, much like Hallowed Moonlight, is another card against something like Indomitable Creativity. Basically, they force you to discard this with the Arcbound, with the Archon trigger. You then get a copy of Archon, get to kill their one creature, untap, and attack with it, potentially killing up to 2 Archons. So basically, one Orvar can kind of blank 2 of their creativity triggers. Beyond that, that's kind of where the deck is sitting. Now, obviously, the deck isn't seen as much play as it used to, but, it is a deck that definitely rewards play. It's a deck that can kill out of nowhere. The math with Arcbound Ravager, Hardened Scales, and such, often you have to play the deck to really respect how quickly it can kill you. It's a deck I know that as a burn player primarily, it's a bit of a tricky matchup. Game number 1 tends to be okay, but when they bring in things like Nature's Claim, Safekeepings, etc., matchup gets a little bit trickier. Plus, there are a couple different ways to kill you out of nowhere, both Walking Ballista and Inkmoth Nexus. Make it easy to have one-shot kills, even if you can deal with all of their other permanents. And just overall, the deck is it's a blast to watch play, and it's a deck that is very... you have to play against it to kind of respect what it does. Now, obviously, there's a lot of things in the format that can attack it. Whether you're talking about all the different artifact removal that you see, mainly Force of Vigor being the huge one these days. Obviously, people having hate for things like Urza Saga can help shut off that angle of attack. People are kind of prepared for artifacts to a certain degree, primarily because of Hammer Time, but also because of Affinity. Also, people need to be able to answer things out of Karn Wish boards, having access to things against things like Amulet Titan that pack things like Amulet, obviously. So, Enchantment and Artifact Destruction is kind of out there, but it's not kind of at the all-time high that it used to be, especially since Hammer Time has kind of slipped down the format a little bit. It's not as prevalent as it used to be. But the big thing for the deck right now, obviously you have a ton of things like Solitude, Unholy Heap, Fatal Push, all these other different removal spells out there, Fury, etc. Now obviously this deck is very good at getting beyond damage-based removal, especially if you have a Ravager or Zabaz in play along with the Ozolith. Damage-based removal can kind of get blanked very easily. Things like Solitude are a little bit trickier to play around. Also, Force of Vigor is a card that you need to learn to play around. But, this is a deck that very much rewards skill play. You can play some small Artifact 8 pieces to kind of slow down annoying decks. And it's a deck that I believe its average kill speed is about turn 4 if it wishes to. So it has the speed to compete in the format. It has the resiliency. The downside with the deck, obviously, it's a little bit trickier to pilot than a lot of other decks. I think it's even trickier than the old affinity lists used to be, although the math is really Ravager math is really the thing that's tricky with this deck. Zabaz obviously gives you that other angle of attack that allow you to destroy your own artifacts. But yeah, this is a deck that really rewards a skilled pilot. It's a deck you'll see pop every once in a while. And generally when you see someone piloting a Hardened Scales list, if there's someone that knows the deck, they really, 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 really know their deck. It's a deck that rewards knowing the ins and outs. And, deck you might see pop up every now and again. It's been doing a little bit better of late. Obviously, doesn't have quite the same resilience and grindiness as the Affinity list, but it also does reward you with a little bit more kind of one-shot kills that the old Affinity list used to have. So if you like these kind of lists, something you can consider playing. As far as its matchups in the meta, I really don't have enough data to work off with it of late. I know as a burn player, it was always a tricky matchup. I suspect that against decks like, Living in Rhinos, that probably has a fairly reasonable matchup in the decks like that. The 4-color piles, I don't know that they have they don't always have enough interaction to deal with things. Obviously, if they're packing Artifact Hate, it gets a little bit trickier. Another card that can be a little bit difficult to play is things like Karn the Great Creator. But, unlike the Pioneer format where you have something like Mono Green Devotion, there isn't a ton of decks running that other than maybe E-Tron and Greentron, and both of those are kind of an all-time low right now. Some versions of Amulet sometimes run it. That can be a tricky card to play around. Stony Silence is another stone cold killer if this deck were to ever pick up too much steam. But that is not a card that's seeing a lot of play right now. And basically it's a worse version of, not a worse version, but it's not as rewarding as something like Hammer Time. Hammer Time has a little bit lower of a ceiling or a little bit lower of a floor in terms of what you need to know. A little bit higher of a ceiling in this deck, but effectively it's a slightly worse version of Hammer Time in terms of what it's trying to execute, hence why it doesn't see as much play, but is still a deck that you can kind of confuse people with some play lines that maybe get a little bit of advantage just from unfamiliarity, whereas Hammer Time sees a little bit more prevalence. So if you like these kind of deck overviews, please consider subscribing to the channel, give me a thumbs up, leave me a constructive comment down below.